Across Australia, Indigenous advocates are pushing for justice reform, child protection improvements, and greater investments in community-led solutions. New South Wales has introduced Cindy's Law to close a legal loophole that denied justice in sexual violence cases, in reducing the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in out-of-home care, prompting calls to shift authority to Aboriginal-led organisations. Queensland's 2025 budget has been slammed for prioritising prison and policing over social support. At the Reintegration Puzzle Conference in Mparntwe, leaders called for evidence-based alternatives to incarceration, especially after the recent death in custody of Kumanjai White. Amid these challenges, 2 new Indigenous-led tourism experiences in tropical North Queensland offer hopeful stories inviting visitors to connect with country through culture, storytelling and eco-adventures. More of that later. Kaya, I'm Leanne Djilandi Dolby and this is the National Indigenous Times Daily News Bulletin for the 25th of June 2025. A long overdue reform to New South Wales Crimes Act in response to the 1987 deaths of Aboriginal teenagers Mona Lisa Smith and Jacinta Rose Cindy Smith aims to close the legal loophole that previously prevented prosecution in cases of sexual violence when the time of death was unclear. The girls were found dead beside a wrecked vehicle with key evidence and investigative efforts compromised by racial bias and police failures. Ian Alexander Grant, the non-Indigenous man found with Cindy's body, was never held accountable due to legal technicalities. The reform known as Cindy's Law was championed by families and the National Justice Project, ensuring future offenders cannot evade justice on similar grounds. Advocates say the change honours the girls' lives, addressing systemic failings and strengthening protection for victims, especially Aboriginal women and girls disproportionately affected by sexual violence. New government data shows no improvement in child protection outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, with First Nations leaders condemning ongoing systemic failure. The 2023-2024 AIHW report reveals Indigenous children remain vastly overrepresented in out-of-home care, making up nearly half of all children in care despite being a small percentage of the population. SNAICC CEO Catherine Little criticised the lack of action and called for urgent reforms, including shifting authority and funding to Aboriginal-controlled organisations. The report also highlights the continued removal of unborn Indigenous children and systemic racism within state systems such as Victoria's Child Protection Services. While some states like Victoria and New South Wales have pledged reforms and investments, advocates stress that true progress requires self-determination, cultural connection, and Indigenous-led care to reverse decades of harm. Prominent justice advocate Tabitha Lean has strongly criticised the Queensland Government's 2025 budget, accusing of prioritising policing and incarceration over meaningful social investment. The budget allocated over $2.3 billion to a new prison and hundreds of millions of police equipment and surveillance, while funding for community-led and culturally safe alternatives remains lacking. Although diversionary programs like circuit breaker sentencing and youth justice schools receive some support, Lean argues they remain embedded in punitive systems and expand state control. She condemned the absence of funding for grassroots solutions in addressing housing, health, education and healing, especially for Indigenous communities. Lean is calling for a radical shift away from court cops and cages toward a justice system rooted in care, dignity and the voices of criminalised people. Justice experts and Indigenous leaders have gathered in Mparntwe, Alice Springs, for the Reintegration Puzzle Conference to demand alternatives to Australia's punitive incarcerative system, especially for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. The gathering comes amid rising Indigenous imprisonment rates and recent tragedies, including the death in custody of Walpiri man Kumanjai White. Advocates including SNAICC CEO Catherine Little and King's Narrative's Tyson Carmody condemned current policies, such as lowering the age of criminal responsibility and tougher bail laws. They argue these laws criminalise children and perpetuate harm, calling instead for early intervention, prevention, and culturally led community solutions. Despite national commitments under the Closing the Gap framework and the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, governments are failing to meet targets and uphold children's rights. The Justice Reform Initiative says the evidence is clear. Prisons are ineffective and costly, and true justice lies within the community. And finally, 2 new Indigenous-led tourism experiences in tropical North Queensland are offering immersive, cultural and nature-based adventures. Medingal Bay Authentic Indigenous Tours has launched the Deadly After Dark Sunset Cruise, which takes visitors through the Medingal Bay Yidinji People's Country, followed by a bush-inspired dinner at Cairns Ochre Restaurant. The tour blends cultural storytelling, scenic cruising, and native cuisine. Meanwhile, Cairns Adventure Group has introduced Overnight on the Daintree Delight, a 2-day eco tour featuring Welcome to Country at Mosman Gorge, a Daintree River crocodile cruise, rainforest ziplining, reef snorkeling, and local food stops. Both packages aim to deepen visitor engagement with land, culture, and community, while supporting local businesses and Indigenous storytelling. And that's today's Daily News Roundup from the National Indigenous Times. For more news, head to nit.com.au and sign up to our free newsletter.